Hi, everybody. Good evening. My name is Christy Sheremy. I'm an associate professor in landscape architecture here. And as this year's on-site manager for the Glimcher Distinguished Visiting Professorship and its associated seminar, I have the distinct pleasure of kicking off this evening's events. We're about a little over halfway through our Baumer Lecture Series for the autumn term, and I think this is a nice moment in what has already been an excellent collection of talks to hear from this year's Glimcher professor. It is because of the incredible generosity and support of Herb and DeeDee Glimcher that this professorship exists in the first place. Begun in 2001 with Ken Smith of Ken Smith Workshop, this professorship brings together internationally recognized landscape architects with our students into direct contact with our program. Sometimes this means our Glimcher professors like Walter come to Knowlton for extended, intensive workshops and lectures, right? Sometimes this means sending our students to offices and job sites of our Glimcher professors, and sometimes it means taking our Glimcher professors out into the field, sometimes quite literally cornfields, to explore the Ohio vernacular landscape with our students. Support for this professorship has brought world-class minds and makers directly to our students, directly into our studios. The official record of this professorship lives in the source books, and I'm pleased to announce this evening that the source book tied to the 2014 Glimcher professor, Michelle Devine, will be released in the new year, so stay tuned for more information on that. With Walter Hood and his practice Hood Design Studio, we celebrate the 15th manifestation of this professorship. Tonight's lecture is in fact not the first time that Walter has been here in the context of the Glimcher. His first visit was in early September, and it was marked by a surge in national debate surrounding social justice in public space, the varied roles played by history in shaping our collective identity, or at times in exposing the cracks within any notion of a national collective. Walter's work with our students, and when I say our students, I mean an interdisciplinary group of landscape architecture and city and regional planning students. Walter's work with our students reflects not only the urgency of this debate now, today, on university campuses across the country, but it also reflects the questions that have fundamentally grounded Walter's practice based in Oakland since its founding in 1993. Walter uses the design of landscape and the formation of public space as tools to formalize and structure social action and advocacy in response to need. At its core, his practice is a cultural one, where he employs an improvisational, temporal, and radically cooperative approach to space and the people that use, want, and need it. His work is about landscape and cities, for sure, but it's also about the stories, the memories, and the records of those residents who use it. And so to the communities with which he works, his firm, his private practice, serves as a kind of contemporary design proxy for the WPA. And you can see the roots of this design as advocacy forming from the very start of his career. He entered practice after earning his BLA at North Carolina A&T, the first historically black college to offer degrees in landscape architecture. After graduating, he worked for William Wilson in Philadelphia and for the National Park Service. And then I think an interesting turn, he moved to the Bay Area and worked, his first job in the Bay Area was working with Garrett Ekbo, whose also illustrious career began with the Farm Securities Administration, designing migrant worker camps. Once in the Bay Area, Walter went on to add not one, not two, but 3 additional degrees to his portfolio, an indication of the disciplinary range with which he approaches his work. This includes master's degrees in both landscape architecture and architecture from UC Berkeley, where he continues to be a full professor and former chair of the department, and more recently a master's in fine arts from the Art Institute of Chicago. He is a fellow at the American Academy in Rome, a design fellow at the Smithsonian, a recipient of the 2009 Cooper Hewitt National Design Award for Landscape, and more recently, the 2017 Academy of Arts and Letters Prize in Architecture went to Hood Design Studio. Walter's practice is anchored in the Bay Area, but it spans the country. It moves from rooftop gardens to underpass parks in Oakland, from fern and eucalyptus courts inside Herzog and de Meuron's new de Young Museum, to the 5-acre landscape envelope that surrounds the building, pulling together the history of Golden Gate Park with the ecology of the Presidio. He has worked extensively in the American South, where his work challenges cultural ideas about normative space. It challenges those presumptive and familiar typologies of the post-colonial American landscape. Our pasts are always and necessarily conflicted. This is something that Walter told me when I was a student of his a number of years ago, and it has stayed with me with profound effect. Walter finds his rhythm in this very conflict. It offers him a productive set of multiples within which his curiosities about the different ways of shaping space can be brought to bear. And so I think if there was a single word that could be used to sum up his practice, his vast works, I think it would probably be hybridity. More interested in the relational possibilities than in any one static or persistent state, Walter's work strikes a balance between traditional programs, park, garden, street, and those overlooked programs, undervalued things to do, and informal rituals. The haircut, the car wash, the card game, sitting to sit, talking just to talk. Backyards are moved to street medians in Macon, Georgia. Precious artifacts like family photographs or the badges of freedmen and women are given new public shared visibility in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Arlington, Virginia. And long-buried, seemingly forgotten histories are unearthed and moved overhead at UVA, providing a new way to enter this storied campus. Walter's work and his collaboration with our students here at Knowlton will be exhibited in the Banvard Gallery next month. There we will be looking at one of Columbus cemeteries, a Civil War-era Confederate cemetery that has been the subject of local conflict, national publicity, and is facing an uncertain future. I hope you will join us for that exhibition, and I hope you'll now please join me in welcoming Walter to the stage.
Thank you for such a beautiful introduction. It's a pleasure to be back at Ohio State, the Ohio State. It's nice to see the students from the studio. I'm exhausted from this morning. I don't know about you guys, but we've been talking about uncomfortable things. And it made me think about what I wanted to talk about tonight. And I want to talk about memory a little bit and how, as designers, how we can break through what I think is a ceiling and go to a place where maybe we can think about our world in a different way. I've had the privilege of being able to make work and think about and remember my own life, which is, I think, an amazing opportunity that one has to do when you're making work, that you can put yourself in the work. I think a lot of people can't do that. I think a lot of people are privileged, so privileged that they feel they don't have to do it, right? And I think that's where the issues are, I think, in our world. When I look out in the crowd today, I don't think I see anyone who looks like me, right? Which again, oh, there he is. Hey, how you doing, man? Which again is one of these things that I would hope a lecture of you guys looking at me give a lot of you the courage, right, to tell the truth. Because for someone like me, I want to know more about the people that I think I know about. But when you go out there in the world, it seems like it's all the same, right? And it's almost like those memories are pretty much the same. And I know they're different, right? And I think that's the kind of world I want to live in. So I want to share with you today some of the memories that I've had the opportunity to engage in places. I'm from North Carolina, and we never went to South Carolina and North Carolina because only Geechees lived there. And I never knew what that meant until about 10 years ago when I went to South Carolina, and it referred to the Gullah Geechee, which were a group of freed slaves, Africans, who pretty much maintained their cultural sort of differences in values and attitudes. And they were from all over Africa to a certain point, but they came together to maintain that identity in the American South. And it's also a place where they knew how to grow rice. And so working with Mary Jane Jacobs and others at the Art Institute, we grew rice in Charleston, which is a wetland. And we created a microclimate, a wetland in a schoolyard, to talk about Carolina gold rice, where Charleston was probably the first place that had billionaires in this country, right? Because they made so much money off of Carolina gold rice on the backs of slaves. But if you go there today, a lot of people don't know it because rice is not there. A table is something that can bring us all together. Food, But memories of eating with my cousins and relatives is something that, I think of fondly. And in projects like this one in Pearl Street, where people were looking at homelessness and how people were living marginally in a space, we made a table and people all looked the same, eating the same food. Right? Or the land of freeways where I'm from. I was just in Los Angeles, and people hate freeways, but they're everywhere, right? And this is Splash Pad Park in Oakland that celebrates the freeway. So you go there every Saturday, and it's the largest market, I think, in Northern California now, and it's under that freeway. You go to LA, and it's as if the freeway is not even there, even though people's houses are looking directly at the freeway. But this idea that these are things that we ride on, places that we spend our lives, they can look better, or we can actually share those spaces together. Or in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the old Reading Terminal and the train that used to come through, that's celebrating this detritus or this ruin coming through with these new sort of beer gardens, which people drinking beer, once they've got a couple beers, you can tell them anything, right? And so this idea of history being layered through these frequent beer gardens, which is a program that they do every summer. Before development, they'll take a vacant piece of land, invite an artist or a designer to create a beer garden. And we thought what we would do is deal with the memory of the trains that used to come through here. Or in Shenzhen, China, the water villages have been completely eradicated due to construction. And these water villages were these beautiful sort of places where the trees allowed the silkworm to form the fish. The fishermen could basically create this loop right within the village, and we created an installation to talk about the loss of water and bringing those memories back. So people had to basically unthread silk that could go almost a kilometer from one little ball. Or returning back to the States in Queens, where water is not aplenty in a lot of these neighborhoods, community gardens, but creating this device that could catch water that allowed people to come here and garden. But through that memory, we were able to take over the sidewalk and create this amazing place where these people came out and actually paid for it. So this is actually a New York restoration garden that 50 Cent and Bette Midler actually came together to pay for. And 50 is into water, right? I mean, he's into sports, drink, water. And Bette is into green. And what a strange bedfellows. Right? And now it's being written up constantly about it's changing people's lives. Or the signs and symbols, or the semiotics of the city, where if you look around, they're telling us everything. But can they also share with us our black heroes? 7th Street in Oakland, a streetscape. We took unbeknownst to the city, we decided instead of planting trees, we would take a street sign and put in 5 black heroes. And this was 2008, so Obama was up there instead of one of the 5 M's. And this is a normal kind of occurrence along the street. And as you come in from San Francisco to Oakland, you're reminded that you're going through a black neighborhood because of these heroes. And as one person in the community said, these were the plates that were on my mother's living room walls. And now they're actually over the street. And now I'm going to show a few projects. So these were little small kind of installations or teasers. But this can also be taken to the role of a project, an urban design project, a landscape project, or even an architectural project. The first one I'd like to talk about is in Nashville. And this is where human rights and civil rights is unassociated, I think, with Nashville. When most people think of Nashville, they think of honky-tonks, they think of country western music, right? But really the term Music City comes out of the Fisk Choir, where these students went to England and the Queen said, oh, you guys are from Music City, right? And so that kind of stuck. It's also a place where one of the first trials of civil rights actually happened. The boycotting of commercial establishments led to the desegregation of them, and very few people know it. It actually happened before Greensboro. We were invited to come down and work on a public art project, and we presented this idea that we wanted to take their archive, these beautiful images that the Carrier Post had gone out to take photos of the agitators for the cops, for the police. They were never published. So there's a trove of images from the civil rights movement that had never seen the light of day, and now it's in their archive and in their historic gallery. And so I was taken by this one image, where in the beginning we were thinking about we would do and remind people of the marching and the sit-ins that were happening. But as I saw these images, I was reminded that the women and children never get talked about during this time, these average people who did extraordinary things. Can you imagine taking your kids to school where people are yelling at you, spitting on you, telling you you're everything, and you're dressed to the nine, right? And still having all this dignity. And so that became part of the walls that we created, which we say bear witness and testimony to the normal lives of people. And it's a very simple installation in a marginal site. It's a public art project. The city was able to come up with $300,000. Hopefully this is the first of many. The walls are singular in that they break apart. They're concave, convex, and straight. And they create a place, as Toni Morrison talks about, a place for African Americans or anyone to come and sit and reflect on your ancestors. And I thought for Toni, and I'll mention it later, it's very striking. She's gone out to place benches, very ordinary benches in places like New Orleans, Charleston, South Carolina, places where there is no sign or message that my ancestors have been there. And this is a place where you can actually go sit and reflect. And so this is a very simple space that has 3 walls now and 4 benches, and you can sit there and look at these walls. And these walls are constructed from sketches that I took the privy of taking images and set them to Piero della Francesca, and literally tried to bring the aggregate out of the wall, because for me the concrete is a 20th century material, and it's a common material, something that one would see during the civil rights. And then on the other side, to basically CNC cut images that are representational, and so when the light hits it, you actually see the images. So sometimes you have blank walls where you see nothing until the light hits it, and the other side you have these really, really contrasting concrete walls. And it's a very simple setting that takes place on the site of a march. And witness walls is just really meant to tell a story that happened 50 years ago, but as one young person said to me, "Mr. Hood, is this from Ferguson?" And I said, "No." They said, "Is this from Baltimore?" I said, "No, this is 50 years ago." So it still has a relevancy, and I chose the images particularly. Now the police in the area really hate this image. I've shown this a couple times, and I've had, "Well, why are you showing us like that?" And I said, "Can you notice the guy is actually posing?" Right? I mean, he's got the guy in a headlock, and he's like looking directly at the camera. But witness walls is also for the public, but more importantly, it's for the civil rights members who actually served. And at dedication, they all came out. And the joy of seeing that someone cared enough to talk about them. Of course, all the people here are autonomous. We don't know who they are. But unbeknownst to me, the guy on the right is Freddie. He came up to me at the opening and said, "Walter, that's me." And so Freddie's the guy in the back. And he described this whole scene. He said, "Me and my friend were going to the movie, and these cops came out and asked us where we were going and grabbed us in a headlock. And then she came over and goes, 'Yeah, that's my brother. He used to hang out with Freddie.'" So then I went home, and I'm watching Eye on the Prize, and Freddie is in Eye on the Prize. Now, the whole time we're doing this, he never said anything, right? And I asked him, "Why didn't you tell me you're Freddie from Eye on the Prize?" He goes, "Because it was nothing. It was something that I had to do." And in a way, the walls pay testament to a person like Freddie, who basically went out and did these amazing things. He went from Georgia all the way to Alabama, 2 bombings, right? And he went all the way through that. But he doesn't want a badge. He said, "That's something that I had to do." Moving next to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, this next project is called Curtain Call, another public art project, and we were asked to a very simple mission. Pittsburgh loves their hockey, right? You guys know that, right? At the top here is the arena that was built in the 60s. They basically came in and eradicated this entire community of African Americans for the civic arena, for hockey, pretty much. The call said, we want an artist and a landscape person to create a bio-retention area, rain garden, and could you do something to commemorate, there used to be this neighborhood right here? I mean, that's, you know, who said, sure. So we came up with this piece called Curtain Call, and I was reminded of August Wilson, lived in the area, and the Curtain Call was an idea to bring people back out to the space. And so in our brief, we said we would collect 7,000 images and then set them in this giant curtain next to the arena. And then when people came in, they would actually be welcomed back to the Hill. We won the competition. They said, you'll never get 7,000, but that's a great community thing to do, right? So we started having barbecues in the summertime, and people started bringing bags of images. And then we had to scan them, and then we had to record the stories. Because of course, you can't just give you a picture of my mother, right? I have to tell you about Sugar Hill. I have to tell you about this. And so now we have an archive and images, and we have stories. The stories you'll have to read at Carnegie Mellon, but the images will be part of the piece. As we were making the piece, we were like, well, there's got to be another hook to it. And as we were researching the area, unbeknownst to me, Pittsburgh was part of the Chitlin Circuit. So you could go from New York to Pittsburgh to Chicago. And this is where all the black musicians went. Because again, George Benson, Lena Horne were from Pittsburgh. And you would get on the train and you would get off at the Hill and you would go and hear R&B music. And so we said, no one knows what a rain garden is, right? I mean, if you ever been to a rain garden, right? No one's out there in the rain going, let's go to a rain garden, right? So we decided to think about all the rain songs, and we collected, I think we collected like 70 rain songs that were sung by R&B blues singers. And so when you go into the garden, you'll trigger the rain songs. And so you'll see the beautiful fauna, rain, but you'll also hear Seal or Aretha Franklin. Against my window. Really loud. Can you imagine after a hockey game, right? All these people are spilling out, and you're hearing rain songs. And you'll go into the rain garden. And then you'll see this giant curtain of 7,000 images. So hopefully when people see that, there's a zeitgeist, there's a moment where they realize the curtain call for people, and there must be something going on with these plants, right? Because this music is telling them. Now we worked on this project, I think we're in like the 7th or 8th year. The Penguins opened their new stadium. Right? And they ran out of money, right? And the community, the Hill District is right there. And the Hill District said, well, how can you run out of money? You just built the stadium. And then a Mario Lemieux statue appeared, right? And so for the last few years, the community and the Penguins have been in conversation, let me put it that way. So hopefully this will go into construction soon. This next project is in Arlington, Virginia. The Pentagon is right over there. The Pentagon is here. Arlington Cemetery is here. Post-war, Civil War, doing Reconstruction, the contraband or free slaves were actually located and housed at Arlington Cemetery. And it was Robert E. Lee's plantation. And it was called the Freedmen's Village. There was a Freedmen's Bureau set up. And this bureau basically oversaw, right, all the land to place contraband in the north and free slaves in the south. And this stretched as far west as I think it's Kansas. I think there's the last one, Nicodemus, Kansas. And these were towns for 20 plus years where free slaves went to school and lived a free life. After doing post-Reconstruction, probably early part of the century, the slaves, free slaves, the diaspora moved out because the government reclaimed the cemetery. And this place called Knock, located here near Arlington Village, became one of those communities where people moved to. And this diaspora still exists today, that people are a descendant from Arlington Cemetery, and particularly in this place called Knock. Another public art project, we were asked to come in and create a town square. It's a town square for a public art project. Why? And it's because the residents, again, mostly African American, felt that they're being erased. And they wanted some place that they can claim to say that this is where, my ancestors lived. And so our first foray to the community, we went here and people started talking about Green Valley. It's like, what's Green Valley? And it's not really knock, it's all of this landscape in which people remembered as living in this kind of post-Civil War, there are forts everywhere, this landscape where as kids they moved all around. And it was a valley, they overlooked the Potomac, right? So you can imagine that kind of view of over the last 50 years, this suburban development just taking over everything. So as we started the project, I started looking at all the information. I was reminded again of Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi's quote about this notion of semiotics of the city, is there a way that we can really use the persuasion, commercial persuasion, and this notion of the sign. And I kept thinking about the idea of the freed man, the freed woman, not freedom, but freed man, freed woman, which meant someone emancipated someone, right? It's kind of like, you can go now. Which you would imagine might leave a kind of a psychosis that I always have to ask someone for permission because I was freed, but we never talk about it that way. And again, going back to my earlier point, African Americans don't have a rock they can go to, or a statue they can go to, or an island they can go to and say, this is where we came, see the registry there? We don't have that place because we were emancipated. So this notion of freed man, is a very powerful thing on both sides. And so I started thinking of, let's make a giant freed. And in the studio, I'm playing around with this, and then I turned it on its head, and it looked like a giant clock tower, right? And then I said, what if we made it out of gold and we gilded it like everything in DC? And we made it really big. And talking to the public art people, they were like, Walter, you can't do that in the community will never go for that, really, let's try something, let's go back to the town square. And I said, nah, I really want to do this piece because I'd been researching Charleston, where if you were a free slave walking the streets of Charleston, you had to wear a badge. And it said number 10, you were a baker. Because in Charleston, if you were out at night, you basically, something happened to you, right? But you had to wear a badge. And so I said, well, what if we took this badge and we basically allowed people, the freed people, their names to be registered here, and this became a new symbol. And that it would be made up of thousands of badges. And anyone can get a badge, but it would create this large piece. And so we're doing this 35-foot tall piece. It's called Freed. It's made up of multiple badges that talk about the different towns in the diaspora, and it'll sit at the head of this small, what I would call a small garden space. And it's pretty much cut so that the light will come through it and you'll be able to read the names and the numbers. And the space is a very simple composition of a garden, and it raises up about 10 feet from north to south, and it sits up at the head at the top. And what I'm really interested in is this, as daily life goes on, there's this memory in the back of Kenmore and Shirlington, where right now these guys kind of hang out in the middle of this space with this meager little sort of notational system there, and turning that into a garden that has all of the stuff that the county wants, right? I mean, all the green stuff. But at the top, there is this sentinel, this thing that says free, that's there with people in their daily lives. So they're constantly, right, reminded of this and constantly questioning this notion of freedom versus freed. This is slated for construction. We begin in January. This next piece was mentioned earlier as Katherine Foster's Homestead in Charlottesville, Virginia. And this piece was done about a decade ago. As they were expanding TJ's lawn to the south here, they found some remains. They found about 28 remains I want to say about a dozen were human and the others were animals. And it's kind of typical in the area that at homesteads, people buried, right, your relatives in the backyard along with the dogs and everyone else. And here, this was south of the campus in a place called Canada. And what we could surmise is, as free blacks came back into Charlottesville, the area south of the university is where they settled, and Kitty Foster was able to purchase land here. You have to remember that UVA was an all-boys school. And so Kitty probably did the laundry and things like that for the boys. One of the students, PhD students in history, provided a lot of this information. So we left the design team, and we decided, meaning Hood Design, and we decided to focus primarily on this piece. And I was really surprised that I went to a meeting and started talking about Flash of the Spirit, Robert Ferris Thompson, Flash of the Spirit, where Ferris Thompson talks about in the South, you go to New Orleans all the way to the pine landscapes of South Carolina, you'll find cemeteries where people will leave airplanes, they'll leave anything flashy, shiny, because when the light hits it, right, there's a belief that you'll get a ride to heaven, right? And I was thinking about when I was a kid, my grandmother, we would go to the cemetery and she would take poinsettias and she would turn back the foil on the poinsettias, right? And if you go to a cemetery, you'll see it and the light hits it, right? And that's the flash and you get that portal. So as we were doing this thing very early, I was like, I want to do a shadow catcher. And sure enough, people were like, okay, we'll do the shadow catcher. And the shadow catcher is a very simple idea that we took the remains of the house and lifted it off the ground, the small cellar, to cast a shadow on the ground. And the idea is when the sun comes out again, you look down at the shadow and you look back up at the reflection, right? And every time the light hits, the Foster and her ancestors have this ride to heaven, right? So it's this constant thing going back and forth, shifting. And these are some of the remains of the building underfoot. But as you look up, there's a stainless steel frame that reflects the sky and the shadow. And I was reminded by one lecture from one professor, Mark Tribe, when he described a cemetery that you go to, and you're always looking down and looking up, down and looking up. And just this notion of getting people to perform that exercise, right, is part of the ritual that we have for morte, or death in this case. It's a very strange thing on the campus. I got a note once, thank you for doing something modern on campus. If you've been to UVA, you know what that means. And as part of the interpretation, there's a small pathway. There's nothing classical at all. This is part of the campus. The burial ground is a set of what I would call sculpted terrains that allow for you to understand kind of burial process over time. I think it's more about the soil in the area over time as bodies decompose. If you go to rural cemeteries or urban cemeteries, the graves are all slumped, right? And so as the remains sort of pass, the ground actually creates this sculptural effect. Returning back to the Bay Area, we just finished a project, Bay Area Opera House. You sort of see the community center note here. This is 1968 during the riots in Bayview. This is probably post removal of blocks from downtown San Francisco to the most southern point of San Francisco. Like other places in the country after King was killed, people rebelled. People took refuge in this community center. From 1985 to 2010, the community center had become a sanctuary for most of the city of San Francisco's public works. And it had become a defunct community center, where during most of its time, post-68, it was a place that was used to teach young African Americans theater, dance, and other cultural arts. But somehow during the 90s, it became this trope for every, how can I say, every kind of self-help or marginalized sort of trope that you can think of that designers give poor people, right? Like, oh, if you see a poor neighborhood, they need a community garden. Or they need to raise their own food. So this place had a chicken coop, it had really bad community gardens, and it had AstroTurf pop-up stuff, hay bales. This is an 1888 opera house. You go inside, it's awesome. But on the outside, they had literally turned it in to a really bad community center. And if you see here, it's really challenged by slope. And the city needed to do ADA improvements. And so they asked me if I would join this team. And so at the community meeting, we go in, and we have all the boards and everything, and this young rapper says, "Excuse me, Mr. Hood, can I say a few words?" And I'm not going to hold anything back. I'll tell you exactly what he said. He stood up and he said, "I just want you to say one thing. You're going to hear me?" And he took out his phone, and he said, "If you don't let me talk, I can make one phone call, and I will shut this shit down." And everybody went like, whoa. And he immediately started to talk about how this building had become this awful place, that no one really cared about the community, about the arts, how it was locked, it was behind a fence, how they were being treated like they were on a plantation. I was like, whoa. And then he said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Hood, I was like, talk, speak, because we were just hired to do an ADA ramp. And he was talking about something much larger. So after the meeting, I went back to the office and said, we have to do something grander. It's a historic building, so in San Francisco, you can't touch history. I mean, if it's historic, if it was done in 1960, you can't touch it, right? And we decided we're going to do these wraparound stairs and ramps that will allow people to use the facility when the building's closed, but it would be something that the community can come to the site anytime they want to and use. And we presented to the city, and when people said, you can't do that, I said, you go back and tell the community. And no one was willing to do that, right? And so, in a way, this image became the gestalt for the Bayview Opera House. And we just won a Historic Preservation Award. And you can sort of see here, there's a new porch, there's a walkway that goes all the way around. It floats through. On the back side, we built a stage and a seating area. So again, you could come through anytime without going into the building and actually use the facility. It's mostly used for after-school kids. Now the kids can come, before you had to go up and down 10 different stairs, kids can come, run around from the stage to the front. It's all on the same level. Anytime there's a performance, you can basically move through the entire piece. Performances happen throughout the landscape here. We cut down at least a half dozen trees. There were trees that were blocking, and we basically opened it up back to the city, gave it light, and gave it a new purpose. And now when you go there, it looks like it doesn't feel like it's in the hood, right? It feels like other civic buildings that you have in San Francisco. And the kids actually don't have to worry about where their food comes from anymore. They can actually learn theater. They can actually learn music. They can actually be part of the larger landscape. Still in San Francisco, this is Golden Gate Park. If you've ever been to Golden Gate Park, next time you go, this is what it used to look like. It was a giant sand dune. And at the turn of the century, it's pretty much, a lot of the hills of San Francisco were decapitated, all the dirt were brought here, and the redwoods and pine trees and palm trees were planted. It was also a place where many fairs went on, not affairs, fairs, and different buildings actually were built after the fairs. And that's how museums actually manifest themselves here in the park. That 1917, the DeYoung, 1921 annexed, by 1926, the Asian, all of these museums came out here because of these exhibitions and these amazing gifts of people in San Francisco. This is the new DeYoung Museum. So in 1989, there was an earthquake, and this thing fell down, got a big crack in it. They said they had to tear it down. People in the city said, no way, we don't want a new building. They sued the Fine Arts Department. They hired Herzog. People hated Herzog. They then made more lawsuits. They needed a garage. They sued the city for garage. I mean, it was just this big debate for like a decade. And no one thought that this was a great idea. When we first started to work on the project, Jacques and Pierre had already created this very simple partie for the building, that they wanted this public front and then this private back, but the landscape rose through one and people flows through the other, and it becomes this public space. And we decided that, yeah, we go along with that and basically push this and reconnect some of these historic elements, but more importantly, how can we talk about the flora fauna of this park, which is really different than Central Park in New York. This was designed by a park manager, not a landscape architect. Homestead came here and said, don't design anything here, do it up on Van Ness, because you have this amazing access, there's prevailing winds, but of course McLaren knew that if you built this thing, the city would move all the way out there and the pockets would be filled with coffers. The museum is like a giant building that landed. It gives us an opportunity to talk about the landscape in a very different way. All of the plants here, primarily the early ones, the palm trees, were all gifts from different countries. A lot of them came from Chile, came from Australia. There was this big exchange during the late 19th century, beginning of 20th century with Australia. We have these very simple sort of roots, particularly with the flora. And so what we decided to do was go around the museum and grab all the plants and bring them into the museum. Because they're a weird assortment. There's like sword ferns, there's like Chilean palms, there's just a wide array of plant material. These palm trees are 110 years old. We shaved them, took them away, and brought them back. Now they sit on top of the parking garage. But from the sculpture garden to the children's garden, there's a mix of flora that try to bring the park into focus. And so you experience most of these through the veil of the building. These are the Australian tree ferns, again, that were gifted to the city. If you go a half mile away, there's an entire grove of them. It's almost like you're in prehistoric land. As you go out, again, it's a place now where people come, they claim their own gardens. It's a place where the museum moves out. There's a show right now, or that was running, that was on 67, 68. But it's also a place where people have adopted as their garden. So on one hand, it works as this huge fine arts thing, but on the other hand, it works on this day-to-day sort of reference. And the material that we were very interested in was sand. And if you look at microscopically at sand, particularly on the Pacific West, it's all different colors, from black to orange to yellow. And so the ground plane is this thing that forces you to look at. And one of the artists, Andy Goldsworthy, took it to the extreme, right? He did a piece, this is $1 million piece, it's a crack. Right? And some days you go out, some people out there with a dust buster, because you have to conserve this. But on opening day, we got calls from the contractor, said, you guys must come out here, there's a problem, right? And they thought the slab of the building was cracking. But Andy kind of did this on purpose. And there's a larger story with it, and the blocks kind of, they wind their way inside the interior. The De Young now is 11 years old. It's about a million people annually come here, which says a lot about its need and use. It's second to MoMA, I hear, in attendance yearly. Some of the shows, and most of the shows, have been primarily fashion. Right, and those have been the big blockbuster shows. They've gone through 3 different directors during that time. But it's a place that's constantly changing, evolving, and again provides the citizens of San Francisco now a new destination out into the park. The gardens are used for weddings. If you go online, they make more money on weddings. But it gives you a different opportunity and a different way to see a space that you could never see before. This is where the Asian Museum used to sit. Now you're looking towards the Japanese tea garden. And if you're lucky, on some days you can find the 3 gyms all the way tucked away in a hill. And this is where you can really kind of understand San Francisco and Golden Gate, where you can actually see the water in the air, because Jim has basically created this knife's edge where the light and the sky actually come all the way down. Moving south to LA, This is Diller Scafidio's new Broad Museum. I was just there this weekend. This is the 3rd year it's been open. Liz and Rick talk about the vault and the veil. I don't know if they've lectured here, but if you go into the Broad, there's a solid vault that holds the art, and the veil is on top. That's why it looks like this giant cheese grater. The landscape beside it, there used to be a hole right here. This is Bunker Hill, so this is the tunnel up Grand. And we had to build a new landscape in between these two buildings. And that new landscape is pretty much an turned up freeway that has the columns on the top so that we can actually hold the dirt in between. The client really wanted something simple, but he wanted something on day one to be there. There is no dirt here, so most of the project, we're sort of dealing with ways to bring dirt up to the surface. So along Grand Avenue, instead of planting trees, we actually plant what I call these bulbous planters with sedum and different types of plants to actually reflect the cheese grating down on the ground. And then a new connection across to Maki across the way. When it opened, again, the restaurant was added to the back. Really good food. You can now pass through. It's a very simple space. If you've been to LA, the way I describe it is there's no whistles and bells, right? It's calm. Most LA is frenetic, big roads and everything, but you go here, it's just calm. There's not a lot of paving pattern. There's no X's, there's no pink chairs. It's just some very simple elements. Trees and some seats. But the trees are interesting trees, as our client wanted. They're 110-year-old olive trees, and they sit in this deck like they've been there the whole time, right? And they have this very interesting conversation with the building. And as we started working on the building, there's no way landscape is going to compete with the scale of Frank and Liz along this road. I mean, there are these big, cacophonous buildings. And in a way, the landscape is very demure, but it also is reminiscent to many people. I was there this weekend and people kept saying, oh, this reminds me of Spain. Oh, this is like the valley, da da da. And people do the weirdest thing around these trees. I mean, they kiss them, they hug them, they take pictures with them, so they're like old friends, right? And in a way, it begins to suggest that the landscapes are not about programming, right? I mean, Grand Avenue is about program. Here, you just put some chairs out and let people do whatever they want to do. And they find things to do, like making out. People make out at night. You come here, there's all the lovers are hanging out. The kids are running around. But it's one of those places where we don't have enough places like that. Because again, everything you go in, it's like fountain, red, blue, everything, bells and whistles, right? And then as we were making the Bosque, the guy in the nursery was like, well, we have some logs. You guys like logs? And of course, we're like, we love logs. And so we actually use the stumps to actually, make places for people to sit. And the lawn is just small postage stamp of lawn and trust. It's like LA people have never seen lawn before. It's like when you do a big lawn, it doesn't mean anything, but do a small lawn, it means everything, right? Because again, you can see it. And the kids, of course, in museums, a place to sort of be and come out. And the materials are very simple. I had a chance to talk to the gardener who told me, Walter, why did you spec sedums? They didn't work. People started stealing them. And now she's like, grass works the best. I was like, okay, plant the grass. So the grass is on the mounds. And at night, it's, again, a very different space where the light is very simple, takes you in and takes you out, and registers more about circulation and less about sort of staying. Only two more, okay. This next project is in Wyoming. And again, over the last decade, Hood Design Studio has somehow fallen into, I would say it's a good gift of working with museums. Museums are very interesting institutions, but more and more their landscapes are becoming gifts back to the public. If you've been to Jackson, this is the highway you take from the airport. There's only one way in. And Kurt Fentress built a beautiful ruin on a hill. A trustee said, make me an Irish ruin. And he made an Irish ruin. And on that hill, people drove by it because they thought it was a ruin, right? And so they could never get people to stop here. So they decided to take, it's a wildlife museum, so they have wildlife art. So they took an elk and put an elk down here, and people would just stop their car, took a picture with the elk, and kept going. So then they said, well, maybe we can do something else. Now they had these huge parking lots, one here and one here. This is about a quarter-mile long, so it's a different scale. So they asked us to come in and help them make a sculpture trail. And we said, do we have to make a trail? It's like, what do you mean? Well, can we think about it? And they said, sure. And so as we started working, this is when I arrived there, this is what I saw. This is 20 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet, 80 feet wide, because they wanted campers to come here. Not once have I ever seen this thing full. In the summertime, it gets really hot here, so this all is melting, and in the winter it gets covered. And so of course they're replacing asphalt every year. So for 3 years, we talked to them to say, do you really need all this parking? And along those 3 years, going back to Jackson, it was very clear that Jackson is a very urban area, urban landscape. And Jacksonians don't like to hear that. So if you go to a rural place and you call them urban, people don't like to hear that. But they have traffic jams here. They have lots of parking. Everybody drives, right? And so after 2008, we started building this thing, and we removed a third of the cars along the edge. And on opening day, this is what people did. And you can't see the cars. The cars are way back here. So all we did was take that 20 feet and create a small terrace. And the terrace is a quarter-mile long. And when you're on the terrace, you don't see a car unless you turn 180 around and see it behind you. Now, in this landscape, when you get rid of the car, you see everything. And it never occurred to me that before, when this was here, if there was an elk over here, you probably wouldn't see the elk, because the scale of the car is forcing you not to have any distance or depth of field. Now, I mean, if there's a moose down here, you would see it, right? And this idea of getting people then to get rid of the road and seeing this landscape has really brought people back out to see Jackson the way they should see. This is a giant moraine that people forgot that this was a moraine and a place that the Snake River came through. That was part of the ecology. When you're in your car, you don't know that. But when you're outside, you know it. And then once you put wildlife art in it, it becomes something really different, right? Ai Weiwei makes wildlife art. There's actually some Picasso here. They have an interesting collection. Picasso did wildlife art. I think they have a piece by Jackson Pollock. So it's a very interesting museum. But more interesting is the landscape. And now that we have the terrace, they use the space in a lot of different ways. They have, this used to be the turnaround that you got dropped off in front. Now the car goes in the backside. So now they have an amphitheater. They have places for outdoor parties. They have workshops. But now they're actually in a landscape. And what better way to have a wildlife art museum than to be in the landscape, where before you were in a car. You could literally pull up, be dropped off, go in the building, come back, get in the car, and go. And now you have to work a little bit. That's wildlife art. And then in the wintertime, it just goes fallow, like every other place. And it's all for the elk. And the trail or the terrace becomes part of that larger landscape. I'd like to end with a project that I've been working on the last few years, and hopefully we will start in the new year. And it's the International African American Museum. It's a very different museum than the one we have in Washington, D.C. Moody Nolan, along with I.M. Pei, are the architects. It's a place where learning and individuals and families and groups will be able to basically trace their roots, which is a different place. It's a center, a learning center on one hand, and also an institution on the other. It's located in Charleston, on the Neck. It's located on a real site that we think has archaeological importance. It's a place where Gadsden's Wharf, one of the largest wharfs in North America, was built. We think more than 40% of the African diaspora actually stepped foot from Sullivan's Island to here, a foot, before the diaspora around to New Orleans. And it's a site where we're able to sort of trace and know where that Embarcadero was. The building is a very simple building, as the architects like to describe it. It's about a football field long. So it's about a little more than 100 yards long. And by it being coastal, it's got to sit up off the ground, a full story, right? It's got columns that are 2 meters wide, right? And as Harry talks about it, you know, the columns are basically holding this thing up, and they come to a point. When Harry first asked me to work on the project, I got a call. It's like, this is Harry Cobb. It's like, oh, Harry Cobb, oh my God. He said, Walter, this project is about landscape and structure. I was like, I got Guy and I need you. I was like, okay, I'm on. But this whole time, the architects have really been, I guess, more open to this interpretation of the site and know that the building is just a vessel, in a way, almost like a cover to the site, and that how people use and come to this thing is going to be really, really important. Joe Riley, the mayor, this is he's worked really hard. He's no longer our mayor after 40 plus years, but his spirit is part of the project. Here's a view from the water looking towards the building. It's got this kind of belvedere at one end that looks towards the Atlantic, and the other piece looks towards the city. You'll be able to, again, from the second floor, look back out towards Sullivan's Island. RAA is doing the interior, and as you go and look towards the city, this is where the learning center is. So when you're doing your ancestors' trace, you're looking back at the steeples of Charleston. So it has this really interesting book ending. It's a place that you will arrive to by car or by foot. The landscape is a 24-hour landscape, like most of Charleston. And it's really the water, it's this connection to the Atlantic that is probably most powerful here. And one of the things that we discovered very early was that this shift of the bulkhead, about 7 feet, and the tide really loses that connection. And then you have the bay of Charleston before you get out. And we struggled in the beginning to sort of think about how to actually make that much more powerful association along this edge. But as we started to work, we started to sort of see this public promenade, that there was access to begin to sort of think about water within this zone here, as people, again, are in the museum, and as people are, daily life is occurring along the edge. As we were going through the project, I think it was 2 years ago, I was asked, Hood Design was asked, could we develop a commemorative piece for the landscape? That we were doing the landscape, but also could we develop a commemorative piece that talked more about this being hallowed ground? And we spent 3 days doing workshops, traveling through the Low Country, talking about this with distinguished scholars and architects, to kind of think about how we wanted to portray that power. The water is everything here in Sullivan's Island. And if you don't know the story, before slaves could come into the harbor, they were basically held out on an island in what was called pest houses, right? And they were washed and cleaned and, you know, making sure they weren't sick before they were brought in to be sold. So there was a second voyage that actually happened in the harbor. We took a boat out one morning and came back, and that feeling of arriving and departing here was something that we really wanted to think about. And so this piece, Clouds and Figures, sort of came out of this idea and this workshop that we had that will now be part of the final design. The landscape design is very simple. It has a north-south kind of orientation. The city is this way, the Atlantic is this way. We have a right-of-way piece where we're creating this, what we're calling a hush harbor, a landscape that is thick in its expression, that southern expression. Sphagnum moss, thinking about colonial gardens. And the way I like to think about it is like, if you looked at it in plan, it looked like a French parterre garden, but it's really kind of an African colonial thing going on. And then as you move further south, the paving opens up and there's places for programming in both areas. There's places for people to sort of move out of the way, and then where the warehouse, where the slaves were stored, which extended all the way here, we have this one remnant, this experience that you enter through this portal. And this portal will talk about the lives that were lost here, the change in the ecology, that the sharks actually came further into the harbor because their eating habits were, they changed because slaves were just thrown overboard. Many slaves died in this place, but you walk through this wall that's highly reflective, and you're passing these kneeling figures that are basically picking rice. There are these rooms that you can sit in that take away all the context. You can sit in for conversation. It's places for people, again, to be there and to be contemplative. There are various vessels that will allow rice to be propagated that can, again, tell the story of Carolina gold, but also talk about the materials, tabby and the shales of the area. And this expression of the cultural expression, trying to create these almost monumental remnants of these cultural artifacts like sweetgrass baskets, that we know people are going to leave things here because it's going to be one of those places that people will come to and want to leave something behind. And as I said earlier, it's a 24-hour landscape, and it's a landscape where I want to feel like the cemeteries and the other public spaces of Charleston. If you've ever been in Charleston at nighttime, you can almost walk anywhere in the public realm. You can walk through church cemeteries, and it's almost like you can hear the ghosts of the city, right? Because you're able to access the alleys, the backs of these places, and this will be no different. And the last piece to the piece is a fountain, and this is how we were able to reconcile the Atlantic out there in the harbor. And I was sort of have always been taken by the Brooks map, which was an early evocation of an image that the abolitionists used to show the mistreatment of Africans and how they were stored on these ships, head to toe, head to toe, head to toe. And when we went to Sullivan's Island, this meager museum that they had in the back, which seemed to be about 20 by 20. And in this museum, they talk about the Civil War agnosum, right? Nauseum. But this one little room had these artifacts, chains. And it had this one image of the Brooks map that had been probably Xeroxed 20 to 30 times. And it almost looked like tapestry. And that kind of stayed in my mind as we started thinking about this fountain. And so the fountain is an infinity fountain. If you've been to Chicago, these are the new cool things in landscape. It's like a little bit of water on some dark paving, right? And you can walk on it. If you've been to like Cancun, you actually sit there and look out and the ocean's yours, right? But this idea of, can we create this infinity pool that you could stand here under the building and you look out and we bring the water up from the harbor to the Atlantic and create this new horizon. Right, so that again, you have this metaphorical crossing. And that crossing, we would have a small shaft that would lead you into the entry. And that water would reflect the ceiling, but it would also reflect you. And the paving would be made of tabby, and we found a paving guy who is able to get shales from South Carolina all the way down to Georgia, scraped off the bottom of the ocean, which really has this beautiful consistency, and it's a material that's used a lot here in Charleston. And this idea of, can we create this kind of ritual with this fountain, looking back out? And so we took this idea of the Brooks map and relics that we're hoping to get from Bunce Island, And we took this idea and said, can we cast these large pieces? This is like 3 by 3, which gives me a 6-foot image. And can we cast them, and can they collect water? Right? So imagine this entire infinity fountain with these 3 by 3 pieces laid head to toe. And then we fill it up with water. And so without water, you kind of read this tapestry, and you don't really know what it is, and you're looking back out. And slowly, they start to fill up. The fountain is sloping. And as the water fills up, you actually begin to discern the figures, right? And then all of a sudden, they go away, right? And then this takes about an hour. Then the water drains back out, and the process happens all over again. And so, again, hopefully, through this visit, this ritual would allow you to take IAM with you anytime you see an infinity fountain. Thank you guys very much.
I was wondering how you see your relationship with art and science, and in those two fields, where you see distinctions, where you see places where they're the same, and how whether you try to keep those distinctions in your mind when you're working, or whether you feel like you're working as an artist while you're working as a landscape architect.
That's a good question.
How do you approach it?
The question was, do I make a distinction between art and landscape? And if I'm working on projects, do I distinguish the way I'm working between?
Yeah, and how the culture influence how you work.
I would say the culture definitely influences how I work. One of the things that I think an art education does that our kind of professional school education doesn't do, that I kind of notice firsthand as an educator, and I'm trying not to do it anymore. I remember the first day of graduate school, I'm in a seminar with freshmen, you know, I'm in my 40s and there's freshmen next to me, and we go around the room and introduce ourselves. And the first kid is like, oh, hi, I'm Samuel. I sew. I've sewn all my life. And he's 18 years old, right? The next one is, oh, I'm Beulah. I blah, blah, blah. And I love doing it. But they're just basically saying what they were already artists. And so no one said, no, you can't do that yet. You got to learn to do this, right? And so this notion of allowing people to be present in their education, right, is something that art school kind of forced me and challenged me when I went back to Berkeley to think of my students that, you know, we're teaching them how to draw, how to make models and do all of this. Not that interested in the person in the beginning, but it's almost like, why? And so it really forced me to kind of get to know my students very early and try to pull out their sense of self, which only gives them confidence as they're learning this new thing, versus tearing them down, right, to get them to actually perform in the same way. And it was very personal, a very personal kind of thing. And that's challenging, to be in a class with people who are sure of themselves. And so you're learning something new, but no one is keeping themselves in check. And I have to keep reminding my students, I'm always asking them, why do you guys all think the same? You know, why don't you challenge one another? But it is through that sense of self. And I do think that helps when you're making work. And that gave me kind of courage to bring some of the things that I started out talking about memory. It gave me the courage to bring that into my work in landscape, where before there was really no precedent that I could look at and say, that's how I want to work, versus if I look at DSR, Liz and Rick, who were art before architecture. I look at people like Mary Miss, who are mentors, Martin Purrier. These are people that, I've had a fortunate opportunity to sort of hang out with them and have that conversation. So that would be my answer to that. Yeah? Any others? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned earlier that you and your students have had some uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah.
And I'm sure a lot of us feel the same. Certainly I do that lately. It's easy to get caught in an echo chamber that encourages you to get angry. I'm angry a lot these days. But what's the goal in design in encouraging us to be uncomfortable and also acknowledging sort of our own complicity in some of these systems? How do we make space for that?
I heard Van Jones, I was on NPR the other day, said something really that stuck with me. He was like, 8 years ago, he said, we thought we could change the world. Maybe 9 years now, right? And he saw this, people coming together, doing something that they didn't, that was just, they were amazing at doing it. And then 5 years ago, even more amazing. And then in current circumstances, we feel like we can't do anything, right? And he goes, if you look at the shift, it wasn't much. And so we get up every day defeated. And this notion of, look back, it wasn't that long ago where we did great things, and we can still do great things. And I think that that needs to be the conversation. That we have to think about everything that we're doing now, that we can do something that's going to matter. Because I feel like right now, it feels like people are like going through it, doesn't matter, you know, I'll do this, it's not going to matter. That energy, right? And I think when you lose that energy, you lose the masses. And I think we got to find that energy. So, I mean, and in the work that you do, I do think that you can bring that energy. But you can also be prophetic. You can also try to go out of your way to kind of tell the truth about things through your own kind of convictions. And this is what I've been pressing, trying to talk to the students about. I want to hear difference. I want us to talk about that, but we seem to somehow have hit that watershed where it's now even more uncomfortable to talk about it. And it seems like now, I think, is the time where we should talk about it. It's almost like we were like 8 years asleep. It's like, it's going to be okay. You know, we hit that. And in a way, we've kind of let ourselves down to a certain degree. And I think we can be more dynamic. We can be happier in this time, which I think can overcome. So that's the optimist view. Yes, sir.
So, the word is really beautiful, and there's a very consistent attitude about legibility that I want to ask about, where the images, whether they're inlaid in concrete or at the base of the water table or the tower, the others, that the images are hard to see. And the way that I read that is that collective memory takes work. And I wonder how intentional that is. And maybe you could speak a little bit more about how legibility enters into the process.
That's a very, very astute, very good question. At the end of the day, like with witness walls, right, the concrete piece, someone said, the art director said, Walter, you have to need a sign to tell people what they're looking at, right? And I said, I don't want a sign. That to me, that collective consciousness comes over time, right? It's not something that is immediate, right? It's collective, and it is your consciousness. So it is through remembering. It is through experiencing. And for me, a lot of these, you know, the freed, the badge goes away, but the badge is always there. And you bring that up because that's the thing that most agencies or most clients pull out to either want me to be more explicit about or they're afraid of, right? The kind of the legibility. Like with the freed, the historians in UV at Virginia was like, well, Walter, slaves never wore badges here, or free slaves never wore badges. And I was like, really? That's the critique? When I'm thinking of the diaspora, right? I mean, if you're a slave in Virginia, in South Carolina, and you're a slave in Virginia, to me, right, there's that connect. And we got over that because by the time the thing was done, it was so conceptually, right, diminished. It had gone away. But this is the question, and whether it's the 7th Street sign and all of that, to me, I want the work to be challenging to people, that I want people to ask, what is that? Who did that? Why is that there? And then through time, maybe a conversation and experience unfolds. But it's really tough when we live in a world where, particularly in art programs and with clients, people want to know. And this is one of the things I learned very early in landscape architecture. Americans, we need to be told what to do in spaces. Americans will go into a space and it's like, what do you do here? Right? Where you go in the other place, it's like, oh, kick a ball, or, do it. But we really like to be told how to act in a space because, in a way, it's been kind of normalized to a certain degree that we can't take the idiosyncrasies that might emerge. So I hope I answered your question. Any others? Yes, sir.
As someone with a background in fine arts as well as architecture, would you say there's a specific, say, art movement such as like Impressionism or Dadaism that influences your designs and the messages you like to convey?
I was immediately drawn to constructivism. And particularly Russian constructivism very early, and then more kind of artists working mid-century in the U.S. If you look at a lot of the work being done in the last decade or so, you can really trace it back to early constructivism. The materials. But then again, I tend to, whatever works. Like when I was in Rome, I hated Baroque architecture, but then I ran into Mark Robbins and he took me around all the churches and through Germany, and I love Baroque. So it's like, if I can use it, I will take it. But a lot of the stuff really comes out of constructivism and really thinking that the early landscape work was really thinking about non-objectivity, and how that could be produced through these kind of formal arrangements of things. So that's what I would have to say. Lastly, Dorothy.
Yes. Well, thank you. I was wondering if you could talk a little about this idea of memorials and memorializing and teaching at Berkeley with an initiative, and the work is done on this and this excess of memory that we're dealing with. It made me realize, hearing you, how much we're always relying on kind of collective reading because I am in the majority, right, and a lot of us here are the majority. You're coming from a minority, and you have perhaps a different perspective. How do you adjust? How do you translate? How do you not fall into the same tropes that we tend to fall on when we're creating or evoking these memories?
Yes. I don't have an answer for that, other than I've thought about it a lot. I've read about it a lot. The places where I tend to sort of find myself is within the kind of Jackson Necessity for Ruin piece, where he talks about the ruin and being able to, that the U.S., we need this time, right? And I was struck by 9/11, like right after 9/11, I was on the jury for the Pentagon Memorial, and that there was no time period, right? And for a lot of these things you're seeing, there's like 50 years, 100 years. And it's really different when there is this time for accrual, that there are conversations that one has, and to me, you're able to be more explicit in what you want to say. And as Kenneth Foote talks about in Shadow Ground, you have to be careful what you want to bring back. You might bring the wrong thing back, right? And this notion of, what do you want to remember and how do you do it? I can't imagine, it's been 50 years for a lot of the civil rights pieces, right? For that movement. But I can't imagine in the 70s seeing someone actually look at that period within 10 years and try to be prophetic about its effect, because we just didn't know to a certain degree. So that's one thing. The other is, the wall, the names, you know, all of those ways in which we kind of memorialize things here. It's really hard to get out of your head and get out of other people's heads, right, of how they want to see things. And for me, as being a minority, the joy has been finding these things or these memories that are unfamiliar to other people, but known to some. Like the freed piece, when I presented that in the community, I got a standing ovation because it resonated with people in a way. And one person came up to me afterwards, and I hadn't noticed it, and they said, "This looks like it comes from West Africa," because they were looking at it, and I hadn't said the word free, and they saw a kind of a textile, you know, a way of weaving and things like that. Thank you guys so much for staying.